Hey, friends. Considering Charlotte is a series that a few United Methodists and I started with the hopes of helping educate folks about what's coming up in the United Methodist Church's General Conference. Heck, that's next month. It's coming up. And so there are many larger topics that we've already covered. We've looked at the revised social principles. We've looked at the sexual ethics of the church, but regionalization is the number one topic on the plate for all of the delegates to come together. We've already talked about it for 2 episodes. We've covered the history. We've covered some of the theology. We've done our best to kind of reconstruct how we got to where things are right now. And then, of course, my role in all this has just been kind of as a mediator. I've left the United Methodist Church, but I'm still very concerned about what happens, and I think that God is glorified by faithful action among United Methodists, and so I've chosen to spend my time and energy this way. I see my role as just kind of being the everyman in this, trying to connect the dots and help the experts all make sense together. And so we've had people from different social locations. We've had Simon representing the WCA in Africa. He's a Zimbabwean. Today, we may or may not be joined by Lloyd Nyarota, who's also a native Zimbabwean, but he does ministry in Canada. He's hopefully going to represent the institutional perspective. Lonnie Brooks is from Alaska, and he represents a very wise and deep understanding of the United Methodist structure. He's been involved for some time. And then Joe DiPaolo is also with us today from Pennsylvania, and is very astute at the different constituencies that make up the United Methodist Church, as well as the history leading to where we got here. And then Amy Valdez Barker is going to be the primary for today's episode. She's going to be, she's been working in the structures of the United Methodist Church for some time. She was just talking about being in Wisconsin and doing youth ministry there on the conference level, going to Sierra Leone and interacting with bishops. She was the head of the connectional table for some time. She's been very active on a number of different levels. So we're very privileged to have her here with us, but she hasn't been able to speak on regionalization with us today. So after last week, I followed up with her and said, Amy, would you be willing to just take the lead this week on presenting the case for regionalization? This is something that the whole institution of the United Methodist Church has really been pushing and saying, hey, this really needs to happen. So we've had a hard time being charitable on some of the different things. We've just kind of looked at each other and gone, okay, how does this make sense? We knew we needed Amy to help us to see things from a different angle, and she's invited Lloyd to be with us, and hopefully he'll join us here in a little bit. So that's my intro for this week's session. And with that in mind, I just kind of wanted to go ahead, defer to Amy, and you take the lead. And then hopefully the format is going to be 20, 30 minutes of presenting. She's got a PowerPoint that we'll post with this in the show notes that you can access and look at the presentation that she's got. And then after 20, 30 minutes, we'll just have a Q&A session where we try and digest the information she's given us. So with that in mind, Amy, go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for allowing me the opportunity to come and share from both my experience and my perspective on regionalization. Let me just give you a little of a background history. I also served as the chair in my youthfulness. I also served as the chair of the World Methodist Council Youth Committee. So I've been swimming in these World Methodist circles for quite some time and been doing a lot of listening and curiosity. I've also taught missions in some of our schools and researched my doctoral work really did take a look at where we as Methodists have sort of gone around the world and how did we get there. So to add to some of the perspective that my colleagues have shared last week, it's interesting to look how missions and how both the Methodist Episcopal Church and the EUB Church spread around the world and how they set up their different entities and partnerships around the world. And in one of my my research work for the doctoral program, I discovered that the Methodist Episcopal Church very much sort of set up their I guess, relationships with other countries around the world as we will be sort of the central, the Methodist Episcopal Church in the US will be the central body, and these churches will relate to us from wherever they are around the world. The EUB had a very different model. In fact, the EUB, when they went to different places around the world, they came in with the intention of having those churches rise up and become their own entities. So the EUB, when they went into the Philippines, they rose up, and the UCCP church actually was one of the churches that was born and raised out of that. So again, Methodist Episcopal Church and the EUB had two very different models about going into places around the world and how they would relate to these different places around the world. Now, I've listened multiple times, both as the head of the connectional table and in my role with global ministries, to the different communities and the different leaders who are in different places. So, for example, in one community, it's really great to be linked to one country. It's really great to be linked to the United Methodist Church, because being a national church would make them very small with less impact in their country and their community, right? So being linked to a church with 12 million members is very influential in their country and in their community, and gives them opportunities to be able to be on platforms to change justice issues and things like that. So there's a gift of being linked to a larger church. On the other hand, there are also challenges with being linked to a larger church, because on the one hand, the only ones, and we see this sometimes in the US, the only ones who really benefit from the connectionalism are those who are in the higher roles, right? Like those who are in the conference office or the district office. But those in the local church, they don't know the difference. Right? Like it doesn't really matter to them that they're part of a larger United Methodist connection with 12 million or less members around the world. They just know what's happening in their area, their community. And so there's like this tension of the gift of being connected in this system, and then the challenge of being connected in the system because they just don't operate the same, right? So when I was with the connectional table and we were really wrestling with the matters of regionalization, one of the questions that kept arising was, so, what difference does it make? How are we really connected? And I did ask some of those questions. I think you rose a question about, real regional differences around clergy ordination and some of those practices that are in different countries around the world as well. And it was very clear to me that the standards of education in some central conferences outside of the U.S. are very different than the standards of education for pastors in other places. And so there already wasn't an equity in the way that they train or that they process clergy in different places, or even the role of clergy, like licensed local pastor. And some very few places outside the US actually have deacons, right? Like deacons, and very few places actually have deaconesses. Mostly deaconesses primarily have come from the Philippines. So already, wherever you went around the world, there have been discrepancies between the standards of education, the standards of ordination, the processes, and the needs for ministry leaders in those different places, right? So, and access, the same kind of access. So so equity of training and leadership does not exist across our connection, right? So that was just another reality. And even in the US, in annual conferences, each annual conference has the opportunity to interpret how they read the discipline and how they vet clergy on boards of ordained ministries and that. So again, there's like this inequity. And as we already know, when it comes to sort of ordination, annual conferences in different places also have the right to choose. And so one of the things that we were talking about in the connectional table about worldwide nature was, these things already are happening in our denomination. There's not equity when it comes to ordination processes. There's not equity when it comes to training and leadership. And if we try to say that the US holds the standard, then it's somewhat almost impossible for other places to be able to sort of move into that kind of standard. So from my point of view, one of the things that we were looking at as we were discussing, what does it look like to really be a worldwide church with equity and mutuality and respect that begins to not say that the US is the center, but each area needs to be paying attention to their contextual needs. Each ministry area needs to pay attention to their contextual needs, and et cetera. So we were lifting some of the legislation when I was at the connectional table forward to say, look, let's just be honest about what's already happening in the system. And this is what's already happening in the system. So fast forward, I mean, we know we had 2019 and the connectional table after 2019 and the standing committee started to really focus in on this idea of regionalization. When I was working with the connectional table between 2012 and 2017, there was a lot of the conversation about, regionalization in the worldwide nature, but not to the degree of urgency as we see it in this upcoming general conference, right? Like we were looking at the general book of discipline. We were looking at a process for the global social principles. We were looking at how do we address these matters sort of in bite-sized pieces to get to where we are. So connectional table and standing committee were already sort of working hand in hand on these larger global elements. And I think in the last iteration, this PowerPoint that we're going to share with you all actually comes from Reverend Neil Christie, who served on the General Board of Church and Society, but has also is a member of the work of the Christmas Covenant, which, yay, Reverend Lloyd Nyarota is joining us now, so we'll be able to hear from him. But Neil shared this to our delegation in the North Georgia Conference and has said that we can make it public to anyone as well. So, but I want to focus in on this part that the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters and the connectional table focused in on these values as they were talking about what does it really mean to be a worldwide church and how do we do this better together. So the values that they identified was, yeah, we want to look for something that really does offer equity across the whole. We want to decolonize our mission, our relationships, and even our structure. What does it look like, and how do we wrestle with decolonizing our mission, relationships, and structure? We want every part of the world, every part of our connection to actually have agency, to have the power to make decisions and lead with integrity within their culture and their context. We want self-determination within connectional systems. We want a stewardship of all the gifts, recognizing that all of us, wherever we are in the world, have gifts to offer in mission and ministry to God. And we want to continue to work on decentering the United States. We want to identify that we want to redefine what we mean by unity. And we want that to be strengthened in all that we do. And we want to, of course, focus in on God's call to us and the mission and ministry where God plants us. And then how we do that has to always be undergirded by our Wesleyan theological doctrine and identity. So these were the values that the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters and the connectional table were using as they were putting forth and determining what kind of legislative structure, legislative process would help us move towards those values. And then I also want to point to the guiding principles that really led the arrival or the arising work of the Christmas Covenant. And I love them because for me, they have been sort of the core of who we are and what we're about as Christians across our world. The African Ubuntu practice and way of life that is based on interdependence, community, and relationships was one of the guiding principles that came out of Africa. The European perspective noted that the guiding principle for them is that we are all children of God, made in God's image. And for the Filipino community, the Filipino Bayanihan was a practice of community spirit and cooperation to achieve communal goals. So ultimately, the legislation and the process that they went about, and for me, I think process is everything, right? The process in which they went about looking at this, listening to one another, and experiencing how do we get this right, and can we really get it right all in one, one legislative session, or is this something that we're going to be striving towards for a while? But what do we really need to address? What's the lever now that we need to address in order to move us in a direction of Ubuntu, of Bayanihan, of recognizing that we are all children of God, made in God's image, who want to be planted in a worldwide relationship without necessarily being colonized or in control. So those were the principles and the values that have been the driving factor for me as a United Methodist in my different leadership roles. And I think as we even move towards General Conference, these are the questions I think we need to ask with every piece of legislation that we deal with around regionalization. So again, Lonnie and I had worked together a little bit on the Alaska Omnibus proposal, but when we were working on it, it was one of those things that the legislation was already out, and we were in 2021, was it, Lonnie? So General Conference had already been postponed, and we were looking for those levers of change that we thought would help the church move forward. And one of those levers, again, was the Christmas covenant. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Reverend Lloyd Nyarota, to talk about how did the Christmas covenant come about, and what do you all hope will be the lever of change that will help us move to those values and principles that we want as a United Methodist Church.
And before we turn to Lloyd, I gave an introduction for everybody at the start of this, and so I just want to share with everybody what I didn't know very well who Lloyd was before this. I'd interacted with him some on Facebook, but Lloyd, the way that I understand your voice to be participating in this conversation is you're a native Zimbabwean. You're currently doing ministry in Canada with the United Church in Canada, where you've been for a few years, where you live and work. You've been an Episcopal candidate in the Western jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church. And then when one looks up the publications that you've published, one sees that you've written on in favor of boycott, divest, sanction stuff for Israel. You express a solidarity with Palestinians. And then also you've written a lot about WCA, Africa Initiative, being neocolonialist influences in Africa. And so that's what I've understood your social location to be. Is there anything else that people need to understand about you as you're presenting these topics today?
Okay, thank you. Sorry for coming a bit late. I was dealing with a funeral, so somebody just passed on this morning. So I wake up to have to go to the hospital, deal with a family that have just lost their loved ones. So those pastoral emergencies, that just wake up and then you have that call and then you just have to leave everything and be there. Okay, so I apologize for coming a bit late due to that pastoral emergency. Okay, thank you, Jeffrey, for that kind of introduction. Yeah, I'm a Zimbabwean. Actually, I'm a Zimbabwean and still a member of the Zimbabwe East Annual Conference. And I would like people just to know that my being in Canada is because my wife, who is also clergy, is a GBGM missionary who was sent by the Zimbabwe Episcopal area to serve Zimbabwean United Methodists who are in Canada. And then GBGM got into that there is a standing agreement between the United Methodist and the United Church of Canada that the United Methodist or Methodist denominations will not do mission in ministry, just like in Great Britain, because of all the Methodist denominations being part of the formation of the United Church of Canada. So having been a missionary spouse, then the United Church of Canada was the ecumenical partner where I got an ecumenical appointment so that I'll be with my family after spending 2 years of having wife and children in Canada and me in Zimbabwe. That just yet to happen that we'll be here. So that's the reason why we are in Canada. We are here to do Zimbabwean United Methodist Mission Ministry. Right, yeah, true. So let me just get to the Christmas covenant. Everything else you have said is somewhat correct. Yes, given my history, my background of colonialism in Zimbabwe, and having born and grow up under the brand of oppression, occupation, and colonialism, segregation, and all that, I feel it when I see it. So that's why I am very strong on the liberation, decolonization, and seizure of apartheid in the Holy Land, to have the Palestinian as children of God be liberated too. Right, the Christmas, let me turn to the Christmas covenant. Yes, I'm part of the original writing team of the Christmas covenant, and the background of how the Christmas covenant came into being, like just Amy said some of it. The Christmas covenant came into being first when we were preparing for the 2020 General Conference. Originally, there was no thinking of writing a legislation. Originally, what we were responding to, a group of Africans who gathered and say, where are we going? What is happening? Some of you remember there was the Indiana plan to dissolve the United Methodist and share whatever was going to come out of that. And then there was the Jones Bad plan. It was basically the Indiana plan that motivated those of us from Africa who started the Central Conference outreach team. What motivated us was an observation that there was now an agreement in the United States to dissolve the United Methodist and share the spoils. And those of us from Africa say, this is our church. I think we have been quiet. I think we have been following. I think we have been just responding to events. I think we have to do something about it. And then we started discussions about how can we preserve the United Methodist? How can we start an anti-dissolution movement? So we reached out to the Philippines, and then we discovered these Philippines had already passed an anti-dissolution resolution in one of their annual conferences. So we connected with them, started the discussions, and the African bishops made a statement that was anti-dissolution, and they made it clear that if the United Methodist Church dissolves, the African bishop were going to continue with the United Methodist Church in Africa. So those two becomes the benchmarks that we said we are going to General Conference and promote the Filipino anti-dissolution proposal as a reaction to the Indiana plan. And later there was also the Jones Bad plan. What we did was to start consulting with the Central Conference bishops. So a group of us went to Lake Junaluska in November 2019. I think there was the Council of Bishops there. And the Central Conference bishops were gathering. We asked to meet with them and talk to them, and we shared our ideas and say, we are bothered about, look here, there is now the Indiana plan, which is a US-based plan. People who were writing the Indiana plan were American progressives, centralists, and conservatives. So that means at this point, the Americans were agreeing to meet together and discuss without other people from outside the United States. And we say the United Methodist is now bigger than an American church with mission outside. So we started those conversations. And then we presented to the bishops and say, look here, we have a John's bad plan. Why is there no African bishops or Central Conference bishops or Central Conference participants on this discussion? It was then we were told that Bishop John Yambasu was conducting some discussions. He said this outside the meeting. He met with us and told us that he is conducting some meeting to see how unity can be reached. Actually, what we understand, Bishop John Yambasu's initiative was focused towards unity. He started bringing people from different groups together towards unity. And then what it develops at the protocol. But then as we were putting together the anti-dissolution discussion, then we get more voices. And then we say, why don't we write a petition to General Conference? It is then when we discovered that there was a 45-day window for annual conferences present petition to General Conference, because the time we were discussing this, the time for petitions had closed. So we were tilting towards supporting the anti-dissolution from the Philippines. And then when we discovered this, then we started then having conversations. And we spent a lot of months asking each one who was coming in the group, the Africans, the Filipinos, and the Europeans. And we had one white American in this whole process. That's the only white person who was in that group, one white American, and an Indian American, and a Pacific Islander American. And so these were the people. And we spent days without writing a legislation, asking ourselves, what are our values and principles as people called United Methodists? What are the values that we are going to make whatever we are doing? What values are we following? That's when you see the three values that Amy has alluded to. That's how they were put together. It was after an extensive process of weeks of not writing a legislation, but discussing about value. And then we started writing a legislation. And that's why you see the Christmas covenant was passed in the Philippines. Now, what are the fundamentals in the Christmas covenant? The fundamentals are, one, decolonizing the United Methodist Church. What do we mean by that? If you look at the structure of the United Methodist as it is presently, the United Methodist is structured as a United States of America church with a mission outside. That is why the book of discipline, if you read it, it's as good as you're like reading an American Constitution. It's like dealing with an American government. And that is why when the General Conference passes something, the normative is America, the United States. That's the normative legislation. It's about the United States. And then if that normative is seen to be having impact to mission, you will have a qualifier that says Central Conference will, or Central Conference may do this. That is why you see the disparity between the church in the United States and the Central Conferences, because the United States is the normative. So we say we need to dismantle that. That was correct probably in the past 200 years. But now, when the United States was sending missionaries, yes, it was their church. And we say as part of our value, we are not blaming our forefathers and founders for coming up with this. This was the best during their time. They were doing the best they could during their time. They were not living in our time. Now we are not living in their time, but we are living in our time. So let's create a denomination of our time. Therefore, that's how the idea of regionalization came in. The idea of regionalization came in that when we meet at General Conference, the General Conference is dominated by US petitions. And we spend time discussing US petitions. And why do we need to bring everybody to discuss US petitions, which is 90% of General Conference? Why don't the Americans do their own business? Then the Africans do their own business. Europeans do their own business. And the Filipinos do their own business. I would like to tell you that there was a serious conversation about having one region for the US. There was serious conversation. And it was at that time we say, okay, we would not want to decide for the Americans. Let's ask some Americans what would they prefer. Because originally, when we were working on this legislation, we were working on a legislation that was going to create all central conferences and all jurisdictions as a regional conference. That was the original idea. But then the Americans, whom we consulted, they presented an argument that we need a place where we discuss national issues. They presented issues like we have one pension, which is national. We have national issues that we want to discuss as a church. And that is why you see the Christmas covenant, what it says. It says we will have central conferences into regions and create a US region. And then in the Christmas covenant, this is something very important in the Christmas covenant. The Christmas covenant gives each region power and authority to create jurisdictions or to abandon them depending on their needs. That's very clear in the Christmas covenant. Any region can create jurisdiction, or any region can do away with the jurisdictions depending on how each region wants to do administration and mission in their region. That power is with the regional conferences in the Christmas covenant. So those are the values. So the Christmas covenant basically is there to provide the parity, equitability, and an equal structure across the denomination. All regions will be equal. And when we meet at General Conference, we are discussing overarching issues. And in the Christmas covenant, there is a clause in the Christmas covenant that still gives General Conference power to say if a regional conference make a decision that is too far away from our values, our doctrine, and faith statements, the General Conference with a 2/3 majority can say, no, you can't go there. That's too far. You are going too much away from what the United Methodist is about. You can't do that. And we gave a high bar to that because, one, we didn't want some people to just organize themselves and then stop a regional conference from doing what they want to do according to their region. So we wanted to set a high bar that it would be something that across the regions, people will say, I think this is not us. And then the General Conference would say, no, that decision by the region cannot go through. As a region, you can't make that decision. So that's probably, I would stop there. I'm not sure how much time I had since I came late and how others have been
That was really good. All of that was very interesting and a good tack. Let me ask a couple clarifying questions, and then I want to open it up to the three other guys. What you said here was something we had been curious about, and we talked about this in previous episodes, how it was that the jurisdictional system was kept in place whenever it has a racist background in the United States. And what I understood you to say was it was kept in place, one, because Americans said they wanted it and you didn't want to compel them to do something they didn't want to do. But then two, also, the thing you said that surprised me, and I want to confirm that I heard correctly, that any regional conference now can form its own jurisdictions around the world. So the jurisdictional conference system can be replicated around the world if regions want it. But then also, without additional constitutional amendment, Americans can choose to get rid of their jurisdictional system. I think I heard you say all that. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, the only one thing I write is we do not maintain the jurisdiction because the Americans asked it for it. No, the Americans asked it for one region. They say we want a place where we can discuss our issues as a national church. And we recognize that the US is a national church, like the Philippines, a region and a national church. But when you go to Europe and Africa, the United Methodist is across country boundaries. But in the Philippines and the US, these are kind of so there's need. We recognize the need for United Methodists in a country, in a nation like the Philippines and the United States. If they want to meet, there are things that may need a regional decision, like pensions, for example, and other things that are governed by national laws, which dynamic you will not find in Africa and Europe regional conferences or like currently central conference because we go across national boundaries. So
Yeah,
I just
that
want
makes
to, but
sense.
otherwise, you are right. The structure that the Christmas covenant is seeking to establish is a structure that is equal, that is parity. So the decision to create or to dismantle or to adjust or to redraw boundaries for jurisdictions, that's in the regional conference. Like, for example, I can give you in the Africa Central Conference, my home conference, there is a petition to create 5 central conferences from the current Africa Central Conference that was adopted in Angola in 2016. Simon was a delegate there. He would confirm that. There is a petition to create 5 central conferences in Africa Central Conference. And to us, we're saying that's an indicator that the Africa Central Conference may need 5 jurisdictions as a region right now. If they want, instead of saying, okay, General Conference, create 5 more regional conferences, they don't have to go to General Conference for that. They will just come to their regional conferences, Africa Central Conference, and say, we are creating 5 jurisdictions from what we were anticipating as 5 central conferences. And this could be in many other places in Africa where the work is geographically vast and they think it can be done better if they break into jurisdictions, but also maintaining meeting as a regional conference. And it could be also the same in Europe, given the geographic dynamics.
That's interesting. So, within the Christmas covenant legislation, there are amendments to the Constitution, and because currently my understanding is that jurisdictions cannot be formed and taken down according to the current Constitution. So the Christmas covenant legislation provides the language for doing this new work around jurisdictions.
Right, correct.
I somehow missed this. Is this news to you guys, or have I just not been paying attention?
It's also enabling legislation, right? So I want to make clear that the step is towards some of this change, but it's enabling the conference to have the freedoms to really sort of shape it. So there's 8 petitions if you look on the PowerPoint, and you'll see petition number 3 and petition number 4 that speaks to this sort of enabling legislation. So petition number 4 is enabling legislation to replace central conference with regional conference throughout the discipline after ratification of the constitutional amendments, right? And it also speaks to the creation of an interim U.S. regional committee, which then would look at, okay, well, what does this look like? How do we do this differently? Is that correct, Lloyd? The enabling legislation sort of gives more freedom for them to keep on refining it towards what's necessary.
Yeah, that's correct. They are enabling legislation. But what Jeffrey is saying, it's true. There is I would go to look for it. There is a constitutional amendment to enable the creation to give regional conferences power, legislative power, to create or to form boundaries of jurisdictions if they need them. That the Christmas Covenant legislation is seeking to give regional conferences that legislative power.
That's new information to me. I'm glad you were able to say that. Before we turn to the other three, just two very quick questions. One is, in the creation of the Christmas conference, to your knowledge, did the authors utilize any language from previously submitted legislation, or did you craft all of the language yourselves?
We, besides the anti-dissolution petition, we worked, because we're working from values, we worked the only legislation that was coming that we adopted, it was the connectional table legislation. The connectional table was bringing a legislation to create a U.S. regional conference, which they said was not looking, they were trying to avoid constitutional amendments in that. We adopted that and then improved it, because what we said in the Christmas Covenant group, we called it the Central Conference. We have become to be known as Christmas Covenant group by the legislation, but the actual name was the Central Conference Outreach Team, because it was a team of Central Conference fellows. What we did in that team was, there was so much hesitance on constitutional amendments. Mm-hmm. And there's been a history of constitutional amendments failing. But we said, if we are talking about dismantling and decolonizing a structure, there's no way you can do that without going to the Constitution. The coloniality of the denomination is in the Constitution. The American centrism of the denomination is in the Constitution. If you do anything else without dealing with the Constitution, you are not addressing the issue. You are not addressing the matter. So if there is a job to be done, that job must be done, even if it is difficult, but it must be done if we are genuine and sincere and we want to decolonize this denomination. Because we're trying to push towards, don't use buzzwords that you are not able to follow up on. So if we are saying let's restructure, there's no way you can restructure without amending the Constitution.
Let's do the buzzword thing. That was my last short question, and then we are going to turn to everybody else. A word you're using a lot that hasn't been defined yet, and a lot of people still don't have a clear grasp of, is colonialism or neocolonialism.
Right.
And is there a shared understanding of what that means among all of the authors and leaders in this, or does it mean different things to different people? If you could just make really clear and concise, short, what colonialism means that you guys are correcting, I think that would be really helpful. And then I think we'll go to Lonnie first after that.
Okay. I think from the Central Conference Outreach Team, there's a consensus agreement and understanding on what we mean by colonialism, which means colonialism as it is controlling and having power over a group of people, having one group of people having power and control over another group of people. And neocolonialism is when that power is now being applied with a way of control, which is kind of sometimes transactional. That's colonial. And, colonialism is simply it's power of one group over another group. Mm-hmm. And what does that mean when we talk about the United Methodists? We are seeing the power of the American church over the rest of the denomination, because decisions are made at the center of power. Decisions are about the center of power, and the rest of the other people, you receive what the center of power dictates. Mm-hmm. I was born under colonialism. I just see it when it shows up.
Lonnie, let's turn to you, and then the rest of the panel. We've got let's have 20 more minutes of just clarifying and questioning and raising the critiques that we've had the last couple weeks. Lonnie, you're muted.
Thanks for that, Jeffrey. And thank you very much, Lloyd, for that presentation. I appreciated what you had to say. I do have a question with respect to the approach in the Christmas covenant to the North American United States situation. You said that the first effort was to propose 5 regional conferences in the United States that would be concurrent with the current jurisdictions. But you abandoned that on advice from some Americans that you consulted who recommended that they needed a regional conference for the whole of the United States so they could deal with national issues. My observation here is that time over the last certainly year, maybe a year and a half, almost 2 years perhaps, has suggested that might be a flawed bit of advice that you got there, because what we've seen is that the United States, in fact, is not that much of a monolith, with huge numbers of churches within the United States having separated now, maybe up to 32%. Certainly a floor on that, a minimum, is 25. Everybody agrees at least 25% of our churches in America have left. And there's a significant regional concentration of that. We see the most of those churches are in the Southeast and South Central, which suggests that we maybe aren't a monolith in the way that the Christmas Covenant was thinking that is true. And to me, that suggests that the first thinking perhaps was right, although I think 5 perhaps might have been too many, but certainly we could perhaps think in terms of the right approach would have been 3 regional conferences in North America. I think that's a significant flaw. And another observation I would make is that I believe that there's a flaw in this proposal as well, in that it doesn't deal with a regionalization of the episcopacy. It leaves the episcopacy intact as a worldwide, in ecclesial terms, we would call this a conciliar kind of episcopacy, which is what we have, rather than our sister churches like Episcopal and Catholic, which we would call a diocesan model of episcopacy. If we're going to regionalize, it seems to me that we haven't really done very much if we haven't regionalized the episcopacy along with regionalizing our conference structure. Those are just a couple of observations. I'd really like to hear from Simon on this as another Zimbabwean in this conversation.
Would you want me to respond to that?
Please do.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Lonnie, correctly, I can tell you that the conversation about the U.S. Regional Conference was intense. But remember, we were Central Conference people who are dealing with decolonizing. So we didn't want to be colonial also. So we tend to listen. But some of us even propose that argument you have just presented has been discussed, has been presented in the process of writing the legislation. That is why we came up with that. Some of us even proposed that let's draw an east-west line on the US or a north-south line in the US. Some of us who read history, we say probably an east-west line may be good. And some of us said, no, let's draw a north-south line so that we have everybody mixed up. You see, so there were discussions about that. East-west, then we say, some of us we say, if we do east-west, we may follow the Marx and Dixon line. You know that much more better than I would. We said, probably if we do that, we may then that will not be good. Then historically, that will not be right. Then some of us say, okay, to avoid following the Marx and Dixon line, let's do a north-south line, like draw a line, the eastern region and the western region. And then we know we then realize also the dynamics in the Western jurisdiction. Jeffrey mentioned about my being an Episcopus candidate in the Western jurisdiction. I would like to let everybody know I was nominated. I was not there. I just received the calls. You've been nominated in an annual conference in the Western jurisdiction, because the Western jurisdiction said, let's cast our net wide for Episcopal candidates. And I consulted a few people. I consulted widely before to say, I was very concerned and hesitant on that. But when I consulted, people say, what do you lose? Let it go. Don't worry about it. And I knew from the onset, there was no way a person like me would be elected to be bishop in the Western jurisdiction. No way that was going to happen. It will never happen. Because even when they started meeting with candidates, I could tell that this is not a place for me. But it was a good experience. I'm a United Methodist. I mean, it was a good experience. I say, oh, okay. There are people who think I can be bishop. Good. That's good. So it was a learning experience. I loved that. And I enjoyed the process. And I think I learned quite a lot as someone from Africa, how the US, probably part of it, did Episcopal elections. I see the differences. I've been involved in Episcopal elections in Africa for a while. Anyway, that's it. So actually, that's what. Then come the episcopacy. The understanding in the Christmas covenant about the episcopacy, if you read, we left that episcopacy to regional conference to make those decisions. Because our understanding is actually in the United Methodist, the accountability mainly of bishops is within the college. It's only recently when the council began to be given to make bishops accountable. If I'm not mistaken, this could be a 2019 or a 2016 development. But we all know accountability for bishops in the United Methodist Church is within the college. The college is the place where the bishop functions more. And then the council, yes, when they get in the council is there for collegiality and probably general superintendency together as a denomination. And having coming to that, the Christmas covenant is not seeking to create several different denominations by the name United Methodist. You see, the Christmas covenant is poised on connectional and united and unity, but also respecting contextual differences. So we are trying to find a balance there between being connectional and unity and also giving some autonomy into that. You may need to know that I did a lot and shared a lot about the Canadian Constitution versus the American Constitution when we come to how will this be functioning, the United Nations, so we looked at all those models and say, how would we kind of draw some learnings from them, how they function, how can they help in the governance of the church? But then always when you do that, you need to bring in the ecclesiology into all that.
That's all well taken, Lloyd. Thank you for showing the amount of thought and reflection put into that. Let's defer to Simon now for reflections on where his head's at.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. And I want to say thank you very much to our brother there, Reverend Lloyd Nyarota. You raised a lot of things, very interesting things. And I seem to pick some challenges. But maybe let me ask first, you made some very, very strong emphasis on those values in the Christmas covenant that you had put in place. But you did not conclude to tell us that they are still there, bearing in mind that as we go to General Conference, we are having an abridged approach from the connectional table and from the Christmas covenant through the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. I'm not sure what is the approach now. Those areas that you really gave emphasis that this is what we had done, are they still there? And if not, what is going to happen. Let me touch on the issue of decolonization. You made some emphasis on the central conferences becoming regional conferences, with this idea of decolonizing the mind, by decolonizing the nomenclature as well. But I also understand that there is much into jurisdictions about the colonial issues related to jurisdictions, and they remain intact. And you then decide to leave them like that, and actually step away and leave them intact. Are we not also leaving colonialism intact in the jurisdictions? And does that solve the problem, or we are kicking the can down the street? Then finally, as we go to general conference, what is the overall approach now that we have this correctional table and the standing committee of central conference matters, bringing in a new thing when we already had the Christmas covenant as a standing pieces of legislation? Do we rescind that first, then present a new one, or we do an abridged approach? What would the delegates understand as they go to general conference? Thank you.
No,
Those are
okay.
very complicated questions. Good luck to you, Lloyd. I'm sure you'll do fantastic. I didn't even understand the fullness of the first one around the values, where they began and where they are today. So, Lloyd, if you could summarize what you understood him to be asking, that would be helpful for me, and I think for other viewers.
I can tell you, if there is one person who can go around Simon's complications, is me. I did that and got his sister. Okay, right. One important question about the Christmas covenant. What I would like to tell you right now, the Christmas covenant is still a legislation before General Conference, and the values in the Christmas covenant are still intact. The Christmas covenant as a legislation is still intact. And if I can tell you, wearing my other hat as the general coordinator for the United Methodist Africa Forum, 2 times we have clearly made it very clear we are endorsing the Christmas covenant. So the Christmas covenant and its values, it's still very, very intact as a legislation, and it still has support. What will the delegates do is up to the delegates. I mean, the Christmas covenant is not the only. I think I understand there are about 4 legislations seeking to do something like regionalization. The omnibus that Lonnie and others wrote as some was trying to bring the protocol and the Christmas covenant together. So that means that's a legislation that is still there. There's the Christmas covenant. There's the Standing Committee Worldwide Regionalization. And I think there's another one, Worldwide Regionalization, something. So there are 4 petitions that are seeking to restructure the denomination. Which of the 4 are the delegates going to pick? It's up to the delegates to decide, like all other petitions before General Conference. The final call on all this, all of us who are not delegates, what we can do is to share ideas, sell the ideas to the delegates, and it's up to the delegates to make that decision because they have the ultimate authority. So, but otherwise, to a long and short answer to that, the values in the Christmas covenant, idea of decolonizing the church in the Christmas covenant, are still standing very strong. Like others have questions about the Christmas covenant, some of us also have questions on the other legislations, how the delegates will deal with that. If the delegates want to borrow Lonnie's term and create an omnibus of all 4, I don't know. It is up to General Conference. That's how I would best answer that. Then the history of jurisdictions. Sure. The history of jurisdictions has continued to pop up in the discussions. They don't have a good history, the jurisdiction, and it is how they came about in 1939. 1939, the jurisdictions came about as a demand from the Methodist Episcopal South, and that's how the central jurisdiction was created. Jurisdictions were basically created to make sure that the bishops elected in the north will not go to the south, and vice versa. And the central jurisdiction was created because the South Methodist Episcopal South then was not comfortable to be in the same church with the former slaves. We know the history. And therefore, that is why the Connectional Conference Plan had challenges. And that is why trying to create regional conferences in the US that are based on theology are a challenge. All that emanates from how the central jurisdiction was formed in 1939 and its history. And as we were doing consultations, we were told by the Americans, they told us, up to now, there are some white churches don't accept a black minister. You bishops say you dare not appoint a black clergy to some churches because it will not work. They will not just accept. There are some churches that will dare not send a female clergy. We all know in 1939, ordained female in the Methodist Episcopal Church were forced to surrender their credentials because the South was saying no women clergy. We know the history of that. And it is a critical question that you ask. Maintaining jurisdictions, does it not perpetuate racism or colonialism? That is why we put a qualifier there to say, if the US as a region make a decision to face themselves into the eyes and say, let's deal with this, then it's their business to do that. That is where the Christmas covenant is putting emphasis when we talk about contextual differences. It only takes Americans to look themselves into the eye and say racism is a bad thing. Let's deal with this and deal with it. You know, if I use the same example to like Simon, it will take us only Zimbabweans to face ourselves into the eye and say, let's deal with the tribalism, the difference and the tensions between the Western and the rest of Zimbabwe. So no one would come from outside Zimbabwe to deal with that. So it is the American responsibility. And probably when they meet in their region, when we are not there on their own and say, now we are here, let's deal with that. Then that's something they can deal with. So I think that's, we acknowledge, and that's a valid point. It would be naive to think jurisdictions don't have that history, and they're having that struggle. And I understand even in the standing committee, interestingly, they are saying, let's not export jurisdictions. And then we said, when they consulted with us, the Christmas covenant, we said, okay, if that is the point, good. Dismantle them now. They were not ready. In the standing committee legislation, they come to the Christmas covenant to have a discussion with us. And that is why the two legislations are still separate. There was an attempt to amalgamate them. And we talked about the jurisdictions. They talked about all this history of jurisdictions. We said, okay, we hear you. Dismantle them now. No, we can't do it now. So it's a problem you have to deal with when you are on it. Then, right, I think that is also addressed about what is going to GC. What is going to GC is the 4 legislations. What will GC do about it? It's up to the General Conference. 2019, there was the traditional plan, the one church plan, the symbol plan, the connectional conference plan, and probably the others. What did the General Conference did? Chose the traditional plan. And when that happens, General Conference prevails. They are the ultimate voice.
Can I have a follow-up question on that, Jeff, through you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just maybe to hear from Lloyd is having said that, does that not have a potential to punch serious holes in the whole regionalization plan if that jurisdictional issue is not dealt with properly? Because obviously, when we come up with pieces of legislation, we want them to sail through. And we do everything we can. We plug all the holes. We bring clarity to our justification in order for the change to be accepted and to be able to be delivered. Do you not see a potential of having serious holes being punched into the overall plan of the Christmas covenant, or even the abridged regionalization plan as we go to general conference? Well, that's the whole idea. We want to pass them, and are we ready to pass them? Don't you think there's that big potential to have it punched serious holes because of that?
That's very Methodist. That's very Methodist to do that. You will never plug holes for Methodists. If you plug a hole for Methodists, they punch another. So Methodists are, bring 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 Methodists in a room, you come out with 7 committees. So, so what we are doing the best we can, and I think this is part of the effort of doing the best we can to say, look here, this is the direction we need the church to go. Look here, if there are issues about jurisdictions, so we are saying, for now, when we make this legislation, let's give the power to regions, create or dismantle jurisdiction. So the Christmas covenant, in that aspect, I see the Christmas covenant as the best offer, in that it is saying, you go home and do your work in your region and see if you need jurisdictions or if you don't need them. And if in future people let's say, just for discussion purposes, let's say I've talked about the possibility of the 5 jurisdictions in the Africa Central Conference. That's a possibility because the Central Conference is already seeing itself big and wanting to be 5 Central Conferences, you see. And if you look at the dynamics in the Africa Central Conference, you would understand how that is important. Let's say we dismantle jurisdictions today in the US. And then a few years down the line, the God being God and Christ being Christ, the Holy Spirit being the Holy Spirit, there is a boom again in the Western world of the gospel, and people are coming to Christ, and the church is growing. And people begin to say, I think we need another structure. Probably what may need to be done is, because this is something new, probably is the change of the word. We may need new language from jurisdictions to something else, because words carry baggages. We know that. Words, and that is why there was a lot about creating the US Central Conference. It was like the word central has baggage of the central jurisdiction. Some of you have been around for longer in the General Conference. You remember those conversations. So words have baggage, but probably what may need to be done is changing the word. One, probably redrawing the boundaries. This could be an important structure that enables the church to function. But the word carries baggage. The boundaries carries baggage. So can then, say, the US region say, yes, we need jurisdiction, but given the reality with 25% of the church having left, the projection I say now across churches in the US, across denominations, no matter which level they are. I was reading an article recently that saying people are just leaving churches in North America, in the Western world. So probably there's need to reduce the boundaries of the jurisdictions and call them with another name. The Christmas covenant is saying, let that business be done by the regional conference, because they know what we call in biblical studies, they know their sitz im Leben. They know their context, they know their surrounding, they know their ground. And the Christmas covenant is empowering regions to do that. That's where I think the Christmas covenant is much important in trying to do the best. But it can be poked holes, like you say.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, if the Christmas covenant crew were not theologically consistent, if they're simultaneously saying we're against colonialism and then they're behaving in coercive ways over the body, then that shoots them in the foot. So even though I'm theologically in a different place, like I'm I'm part of the Global Methodist Church now. I'm personally looking forward to being told what to do by Africans. I just don't think Americans have done a great job deciding what we should do. That's me being theologically consistent there. But this alternative that Lloyd is presenting and many others on the Christmas covenant is, let's not tell each other what to do. Let's leave each sitz im Leben alone and let them govern themselves and still be held together by some common identity. And I'm selfishly wanting to talk a lot more about that. But Joe, you've been sitting so patiently. You're just bubbling up with all kinds of things you want to say. So let's listen to Joe for a
I
bit.
have a list of things, but I don't think I can get to them all. But two things I want to focus on. One is, as I've heard the discussion about colonialism and neocolonialism, if the basic definition, as I understand it, is the exercise of power and control by one group over another, I think we have to be honest that one way, maybe the primary way that power and control is exercised, is through money, through dollars. And the reality is that the overwhelming majority of the money that's generated in the United Methodist Church comes from America and is lodged in America. Reserves, enormous reserves in annual conferences, enormous reserves in general boards and agencies like Church and Society or Board of Global Ministries, things of that sort. I don't see the Christmas covenant really addressing the boards and agencies unless I'm missing something. Will the boards and agencies now become part of the U.S. Regional conference, or will they be globalized and be also something that will be under the control of the general church? I think that's an important point, because the folks that control the money are going to control a lot of what happens and what's permitted and what's not in various places. So that's a concern, that colonialism can be exercised in different ways, even with this regional structure. And,
Before you go on, Joe, yeah. I just think it's really important to emphasize John Lomperis 2 years ago went down the list of the general boards and agencies and showed just how woefully represented Africans in particular are on those. And that has huge implications. So if I could just tag on to your question, that particular concern, I think that would be a worthy thing. So go on, Joe, with your next one.
But so the next one is really a question, a what if question. I think it's maybe the big question on the table, and it will relate to that in a way that I'll make clear. What happens? What's the scenario or potential scenarios if the Christmas covenant or other regionalization proposals on the table fail? We know that they need a 2/3 supermajority, not just by the delegates in Charlotte, but also then afterward by an aggregate of 2/3 of all the voting delegates in the annual conferences around the world. What if it fails to pass? What then is the likely scenario going forward? Would then we see, I think we'll see, growing majority of non-US delegates at the General Conference. Just to run through some numbers, back in 2019, the GCFA data, General Commission on Finance Administration, said that we had about 6.5 million members in the US and about 6.5 million members outside the US in the central conferences. By 2021, the membership in the US had dropped to 5.7 million and attendance down to 1.3 million, while the average attendance outside the US, the most recent figures are still 4 or 5 years old, were 3.6 million. So we're seeing this demographic shift that I think within not too many years, you're going to have a majority of delegates at General Conference that will be probably from Africa alone, if not certainly from the central conferences as a whole. Why not? A, that may be what happens if the Christmas covenant fails. B, why not let that process take place? And then you have the ability for the global delegates to be in the positions of power and authority in all of the church structures. So I guess I'm complicating the question, but what happens if it fails? What do we see as the scenario? And maybe it's not a bad scenario. Maybe it winds up being another way to dismantle colonialism, because we're going to have increasing majorities in control who are not US. I throw all that out to you and see where it goes.
You're muted, friend.
Thank you. Just interesting that Jeff mentioned your part. I was reading the Global Methodist Church Book of Doctrine and Discipline, and I found out that the structure is going towards regionalization. But you have just not figured out how you are going to regionalize. But you have put like the structure will be regionalized. I was reading it. It was very interesting. Oh, okay, interesting. This is what they are thinking about regionalization as part of the structure of the global Methodist. But it looks like in that clause, is it 60 or something? I'm not, but I'll check it because. So I went through it because I've been following with interest and reading every article, every version that has come of the book of Doctrine and Discipline, and say, interesting. They're quite interesting things there. Okay, so I just want, then in terms of resources, yes, you are correct. I made a presentation in Tanzania, which I could confirm some were not happy. And we were talking about resources and how resources for the denomination are resources for the denomination. And as an African, I always tell people I'm never apologetic about wanting the resources of the denomination in the denomination because it's beyond the church. The whole history of colonialism tells us how when we ask for resources as Africans, I tell people I have no apology to it because one, history tells us when the world was coming to being, what did Africa face in terms of resources or what happened to us? Our most capable, most intelligent, strongest human beings were captured like animals, pegged in ships like sardines, shipped to the Americas to develop the American economy. Whilst we were forced to run away, and those who were handed were the strongest and the most intelligent, and those were the people who are, because you wanted people who have the stamina to survive the transatlantic and get there alive. They have to be very strong people. So we were losing our best taken into the Americas to develop that economy. So that's what our resources shipped. Right? When that was being stopped, when the world was saying slavery is not good, what did Europe and the others did? Colonialism. They say instead of shipping them, we are going there, subjugate them, and make them work for us, exploit the resources, ship every profit to the Western world.
Lloyd,
So what is
that's great.
happening again? Resources. Okay, let me finish because this is quite about resources.
Right.
I'm addressing that issue. Right. When that phase of decolonization came, what happens now? Mineral resources capturing. If you go into the Congo, the wars in Africa, rebel wars, we used to see AK-47s there. That tells you where the guns were coming from. It will tell you China and Russia. Now go into rebel movements, the AK-47 have disappeared. You see the M3. That tells you who is funding these wars, America and Canada. Resources being expatriated. You see, and I said this, most of these mining companies exploiting resources in Africa, most of them, their headquarters are in New York, Washington, D.C., Illinois, you name them, London, and who are CEOs of these companies, where all this money is going, where the downstream economies who are benefiting, some of them United Methodist, and those dollars are finding their way into the plate on Sunday and throughout. And then when we ask for those resources to be shared, we do it unapologetically. So we will not take an argument that says we put the money. If you follow, there was an article by Mainstream that says that I responded to it and say we will not take that. You cannot tell us that we put the money, therefore we have the control. That's why we say decolonizing and neo-colonialism, no matter from which angle it comes from, we will resist it. So in terms of, you are very right, Joseph. In terms of resources, we know, but we know how these resources are there also. Right. Number two, the question on boards and agencies. Yes, question of boards and agencies is a question that we have raised, and our understanding, at least if you read in the book of discipline, boards and agencies are supposed to serve the church. But for the years, they have been serving only the United States. And we are saying this cannot continue. Besides GBGM and probably one or two other agencies. Most of the agencies and boards, they function in the US, and we are saying this must not be. If you are resourcing the church, you must resource the church, the whole connection. And I think that's a functional and operational problem rather than a constitutional problem. That problem is operational, it's functional. And it's mainly on the people who sit at the top of these agencies. And we are beginning to say it is a time the general secretaries in the agencies must be distributed. We can't have all general secretaries being Americans. And we cannot have all general agencies headquartered in the United States, Nashville, Chicago, Washington, New York. You see, we're distributed in the US. Now it's time we are saying this must be dismantled. That's a functional problem. It's not a constitutional problem. That's a functional, which can be dealt with functionally. And then
My question is,
colonialism
if it
is a
fails.
mentality, rather.
My question about if it fails to pass, what's
If
the
it fails,
scenario?
yeah, right. What I know, effect of life, and I've said this in many places. This is the last general conference with Americans in the majority.
No doubt, no doubt.
This is the last one.
Right.
And let me tell you, I mean, I'm always I'm as open as a book. I have actually told some people that we don't need the 2026 special session. We don't need it.
Yeah.
Because it is trying to still give advantage to the American majority. Because if we do the math going to 2028,
Exactly.
I can tell you Africa will be the majority of the delegates.
Right.
And we have suffered under colonialism. We don't want to colonize anybody. We don't want. We are not going to do that. By nature, Africans are hospitable. That's why we are easily conquered. We receive everybody with hospitality and love and accommodation. And we will continue that. We are not going to be saying now we are in the majority, it's payback time. No, we don't. It's not within our nature as Africans.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm
Right.
not suggesting that, although I don't think Africans are exempt from original sin any more than Americans. But I would
Yeah,
suggest,
we have our own
right.
sins, sure.
The concern is why the push for regionalization now, then, if in fact we're going to have a situation where in just 4 years, we'll be able to have a much more even-handed dialogue. There will not be, Americans will no longer be dominant, but they'll still have to be partners in the dialogue. And with a lot of unanswered questions as to how we're going to deal with boards and agencies, it's not just boards and agencies with reserves and money, it's annual conferences with a lot of money that they send overseas as well, that they can use to exercise power as well. So there's a lot in the mix that just seems, I'm not sure has been thought through as well. But
Joseph, it's neither today nor tomorrow. I think we are talking about restructuring a 200,
sure,
over 200-year structure, which has been changed in the process.
Right.
You know, if we say it's a 200-year structure, it may not be very true because in 1939 a new structure came, 1968 another came. So, and I think when there's job to be done, you just do it at the time you recognize. If you recognize that I'm going in the wrong direction, you cannot say, I will pass the 5 exits until I get somewhere. I mean, why would you want to continue in the wrong direction? Exit and turn and go in the right direction. At the moment you realize you're lost correct direction. And I think the facts about waiting and all that, I think that's more political than change.
Well, perhaps this then points to the suggestion that's been made in other sessions, is that what's really needed is a constitutional convention type of conference, that's the focus of. There's a lot of things on the table coming before this general conference, many things that are on the table that I don't know how they're going to get to them all. If the critical issue is a restructuring of the church to make it global, then maybe that ought to be the thing that is focused on in a constitutional gathering. I think, Lonnie, you've raised this in the past.
It was Amy actually that brought
Amy,
it up.
okay.
But I fully supported it. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, but I think at the same time, our current structure only gives that authority and power to general conference. So until that changes, this is the structure we have.
Mhm.
That is the denomination we have. And that is what we are working with. We work with what we have. We may have other wishes, but that's not what we have at the moment. We work with what we have at the moment is General Conference is the place where we do this kind of business. And the General Conference is coming. Let's do it. Now, the fact it will fail or it may not fail, I mean, every General Conference, I don't know, I've only been to probably 3, but some of you may have been to more. I don't know in the history of General Conferences in the United Methodists if you have ever cleaned the slate. And I think that's why General Conference made a rule that whatever is not done when it's time to adjourn, you adjourn. And then whatever is not done is not done. There is another 4 years coming. If the Christmas covenant fell, what are we thinking, some of us? If the Christmas covenant fell in 2024, there's 2028. We'll come again. Until we have dismantled the colonial structure, we will not give up.
I think all that is well taken, and it's a big effort that you guys have done. So I don't envy you, and my brain does not work in these ways, and so I admire everyone who has the patience for this sort of thing. And it bears repeating that a lot of this is undergirded by certain ideology or theology around common identity in Christ versus different identities in worldly culture, and how it is that the church is administered in light of these things. So, and it's your prerogative, of course, to wage that conversation in the ways that you do. I have to come back just as the GMC rep. I've been going through the Transitional Book of Doctrines and Discipline, and maybe you saw something that I didn't, but I've been coming through and I haven't seen anything yet to indicate that we're going to do regionalization. But a recent development was that they allowed for a Korean American annual conference to be formed that allows Koreans to be separate from Anglos. And I see that sort of thing being made room for here in the sort of legislative effort that you're providing for whenever you're going to have different cultures be isolated from one another. That concerns me very much, and that's going to be the United Methodist Church's own struggle to have. With respect to this regionalization issue, I think the conversation is incomplete without acknowledging the elephant in the room, which is that a lot of Americans and institutional people are a big fan of your plan because it will finally allow them to change the sexual ethics of the United Methodist denomination. And hypothetically, that allows Africans to be separate and disconnected from that, but there are also a lot of black and brown people here in America that will be very alienated from such a decision. Right now, if the Africans are allowed their place at the table to be in dialogue with Americans and in some ways restrict their behavior, then they can protect the information, the ethics, the morals of a global majority that is associated primarily with black and brown people. But if regionalization passes, then an Anglo majority in America that is moneyed and upper middle class is able to impose its will on sexual ethics with a lower class, higher pigment population that is now effectively abandoned by African. Who can no longer speak to the American context. And I hear you saying that 2/3 of the regional conferences can then vote to shut that down, but you know Americans are not going to put up with that at all. And so it seems to me and many others that whether or not your intentions are good, your legislation is going to be used to justify American sexual licentiousness. And that would be really quite detrimental, I believe, to the United Methodist Church as a whole. Do you have a response to that you think could perhaps help me think differently about it?
Yeah, I have a response. The sexual issue has become kind of an issue that tended to define most of the discussions in the United Methodist. And it's because of the history of how this has played out, especially probably in the US. But what I can say is the Christmas covenant, when we were writing it, when we were working on it, the sexuality debate was not part of our thinking process. Our thinking process, and you can see the group of people who are writing the Christmas covenant. If you look on the list, it's majority Africans than Filipinos. And we are coming and inspired by our quest for decolonizing and looking for a church that is parity. So that's the basis. Now, when that happens, what each region will do with that, then it's up to that region. But, there's something that is called the tragedy out of good intentions. So each region, and I have established something that I think people take it for granted. I don't think it is true that the United Methodist Church in the US, I mean, like now, excluding those who have left, those who have remained even right now, the United Methodist Church in the United States is not that progressive. I don't think so.
But the leadership certainly is.
Yeah, it could be the leaders, but I'm talking about the church here. I'm talking about the church.
No, you're right. On the grassroots level, they're still pretty moderate conservative, but the leadership is all very far left.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. And it is all these people. You see, what happens, here's what happens. What will happen? I'm just hypothetically presenting this, and it says an American environment that I may be right or wrong. Once people come to a point they realize, and it's up to the people, because everyone, we are our own liberators. I think that's something different with those of us who came out of colonialism and liberation movement processes, is the belief that you are your own liberator. If the people in the congregations begin to realize that we are going in a bad trajectory, it's up to them to elect the delegates to the annual conferences who represents what they believe in. And when they get to the annual conferences, it's those delegates who will elect delegates to the jurisdictions who believe in what they believe in. And it is those delegates who will elect their bishops, the leadership. So it all boils down to the congregation. Our structure, that's the beauty of the Methodist structure. It only takes the people in the pew to realize their power and that God has given them, that Christ has given them. And our structure was made in that way. That is why every clergy has a lay delegate from the pastoral charge level. So if the church in the pew is conservative, how are they electing a progressive delegate to an annual conference? How is that happening?
That would be another whole show, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah, it would.
Exactly.
That's a question that people like me have been.
So just my point here being that time is coming when the congregation began to say, okay, not this.
Well,
this is where we are going.
But many of the congregations are choosing to leave, at least here, and that's been the way it's responded.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think some are leaving, but my point was for those, I'm talking about those who have remained.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to get into the debate of those who have left. Those who have left, they have left. Bless them. That's okay. Churches have been founded for over 2,000 years. You see, and especially with this denomination of ours, it has splitted, rejoined. Probably 50 years from now, our grandchildren will be saying, what were these things people were thinking when they separated? Let's come back together. It happened in 1939.
Lloyd, we've spent more time on this than any of us wanted or planned on, and I think it's because you've been such a helpful conversation partner, and it's just such a worthy topic. But surely viewers are tired after this much time. I know I'm tired. Maybe there's a follow-up in order, but I just want to say thank you on behalf of the whole crew for spending time with us. We're going to be sifting through the information that you've given us today and putting that in dialogue with the other topics that are coming forward. Next week, I believe it's our intention to talk about the Episcopal Order of the United Methodist Church and how that clearly relates to globalization as well, or regionalization. So we need to wrap, but viewers, we thank you for being along the ride with us, and I've certainly learned a lot today. I hope you have. We're going to move on from regionalization from here, but odds are we're going to come back as the date for General Conference comes closer. So if you have questions you want us to address, make sure to email those to plainspokenpod@gmail.com. And then make sure to comment on the video, or if you've listened to this to audio. We want to know how people are receiving this and what questions you hope we deal with in the future. So God bless you. Thank you for dealing with us, and we'll see you next week.